What happens to a society if death stops being a law of nature and becomes a design choice? In the mid-1990s, an 82-year-old oil prospector from Texas thought he'd found the way to find out. He wore a black Stetson, played competitive tennis, and talked calmly about living to 200. His name was Miller Quarles, and he was convinced that the key to human immortality had already been isolated, not in a lost elixir, but in a few microscopic letters of DNA at the ends of our chromosomes. He poured his fortune into a tiny startup in California called Geron, led by a biologist named Michael D. West. Together, they weren't just funding another drug. They were trying to cancel old age itself. Tonight, we open the file on Miller Quarles, telomeres, and the first modern attempt to engineer our way out of mortality. An oil man declares war on time. Before he went hunting for the biology of immortality, Miller Quarles hunted oil. He was a geophysicist with a knack for reading the subsurface like a ledger. The same pattern-seeking instinct that found reservoirs in the Texas plains eventually fixed on a different resource, extra years of life. In interviews from the 1990s, Quarles describes the moment he saw aging not as fate, but as a solvable engineering problem, reading about the Human Genome Project and wondering why no one was searching for the gene for aging and simply repairing it. He didn't stop at wondering. Quarles founded the Curing Old Age Disease Society, CODES, wrote letters to politicians warning that tolerating death by aging was fatal neglect, and even offered cash prizes for anyone who could genetically cure old age by the year 2000. But the most consequential thing he did was cut a check. In 1990, he backed Michael D. West, a young biogerontologist in Dallas, to launch Geron Corporation. The company's core idea was simple and audacious. If you can understand and control the mechanism that limits how many times a human cell can divide, you can, in principle, rewrite the lifespan of the human body. By 1992, Geron had moved to Silicon Valley, assembled a high-end scientific advisory board, including future Nobel laureates in telomere biology, and secured tens of millions in venture capital. Journalists started calling it a company in search of eternal life. Quarles began to tell reporters that the cure for aging might be only a few years and enough money away. To understand why he believed that, we have to zoom down to the very tip of the chromosome, the fuse at the end of the genome. Every time one of our cells divides, it has to copy around 3 billion letters of DNA, yet the machinery that does the copying can't quite reach the very ends of each chromosome. Evolution's workaround is to attach an expendable cap to those ends, telomeres. Think of them like the plastic tips on a shoelace or the sacrificial length of a fuse. With each cell division, a little bit of that protective sequence is shaved off, while the essential genes just behind it are preserved. Eventually, the cap is worn down. The cell senses danger and enters a state called senescence. It stops dividing and begins to fail. In the 1980s and 90s, Elizabeth Blackburn, Carol Greider, and Jack Szostak mapped out this system in detail, identifying telomeres and the enzyme telomerase that rebuilds them. Their work showed that in simple organisms, losing telomeres meant loss of chromosome integrity and ultimately cell death. For this, they would later share the 2009 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. Geron saw an opening. If telomeres act as a kind of cellular clock, and telomerase is the hand that resets it, then aging might be, at least partly, a matter of running out of fuse. Reset the fuse, the thinking went, and you reset the clock. Throughout the early 1990s, Geron scientists and their collaborators in academic labs raced to clone key components of human telomerase and lock down patents on its use. They showed that most normal human cells have little or no telomerase activity, while roughly 90% of cancers do. They also demonstrated that introducing telomerase into certain normal cells in culture allowed them to surpass their usual lifespan, dividing far beyond the so-called Hayflick limit. In other words, in a dish, they could make ordinary human cells behave as if they were immortal. This is the kind of result that lights up both scientists and headline writers. One account in the mid-1990s noted, almost breathless, that adding telomerase elongates the telomeres and makes the cells immortal, a line that captured exactly the hope and the oversimplification built into the work. For Miller Quarles, it was confirmation. He even donated his own cells to some of these experiments. If telomeres could keep his neurons dividing in a lab, he reasoned, the same trick might one day keep his brain young inside his skull. But while Quarles was thinking about an immortal body, Geron's leadership was looking at a far more immediate target, the cancer pivot. Telomerase does not care whether it is preserving healthy tissue or a malignant clone. It simply keeps the fuse from burning down. By the mid-90s, Geron scientists and others had published evidence that the vast majority of human tumors rely on telomerase to maintain their telomeres and continue dividing. That turned the enzyme into a double-edged sword, a potential tool for rejuvenating healthy cells and a bullseye for cancer therapy. The money followed the cancer angle. Venture capital and pharmaceutical partnerships poured in as Geron shifted its emphasis toward telomerase inhibitors and, later, toward stem cell-based regenerative medicine. Quarles' dream of a direct whole-body cure for old age was quietly moved to the back of the cabinet while the company tried to turn telomerase into a marketable drug target. Telomerase-targeting therapies like imetelstat made it into clinical trials for blood cancers, with some promising but complex results. At the same time, West left Geron to lead advanced cell technology and later new ventures in stem cell science, arguing that rebuilding tissues might ultimately be more meaningful than just letting cells divide forever. From a business standpoint, this was rational. Cancer is a vast, immediate market with clear regulatory pathways. An open attempt to engineer human immortality is not. For Miller Quarles, it meant the cure for aging seemed to be slipping just beyond his lifetime. What the telomere revolution actually gave us 3 decades later, how did the telomere gamble play out? On the plus side, telomere biology moved from the fringe to the center of aging research. Large epidemiological studies now show that people with longer telomeres, on average, tend to have lower risks of certain age-related diseases and may enjoy more years of healthy life. Shortened telomeres are linked to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and some neurodegenerative conditions. We have also mapped out the dark side. Experiments and clinical observations suggest that letting telomeres run too long, or switching telomerase fully back on, can greatly increase the risk of cancer because it removes one of the last brakes on runaway cell division. Carol Greider's work in particular emphasized this trade-off. Too short, and we get degenerative disease. Too long, and the odds tilt toward malignancy. The trick, if there is one, is balance. Meanwhile, the broader field of geroscience has mapped many other hallmarks of aging: DNA damage, epigenetic drift, mitochondrial dysfunction, senescent cells, stem cell exhaustion, and more. Telomere erosion is important, but it's only one member of a crowded cast. So the clean story that captivated the early 1990s, the idea that aging is simply a matter of a genetic fuse burning down, and that we can fix it by lengthening the fuse, looks, in hindsight, like an elegant first draft. It wasn't wrong, it just wasn't the whole mechanism. the man who wanted a deadline. Through all of this, Miller Quarles remained remarkably consistent. Profiles from the era show him meticulously managing his diet, swallowing handfuls of supplements, practicing karate, and playing tournament tennis into his 80s, all in an effort to stay alive long enough for the cure to arrive. He joked that most people around him were committing slow suicide by smoking, drinking, and ignoring the coming revolution in aging science. He also confronted the ethical backlash directly. In one magazine interview, Quarles is challenged with worries about overpopulation and playing God. If people live to 200, won't the planet buckle? He counters with demographic data on falling birth rates and ideas about voluntary fertility control, arguing that the real immorality is accepting old age death as inevitable when we have the tools to challenge it. Religious critics worried that extending life indefinitely would interfere with divine plans. Quarles' response was essentially practical. Humans have been pushing back the boundaries of mortality since we first boiled water to kill microbes. This, to him, was just a more precise extension of that same impulse. Not everyone was convinced. Even within the scientific community, many researchers cautioned that promising immortality to investors and the public was premature at best, misleading at worst. They preferred more modest language: delayed aging, extended health span, targeted treatment of age-related disease. By the time telomere scientists collected their Nobel Prize in 2009, Quarles himself was gone. The cure hadn't arrived in time. Visionary, cautionary, or both? So what do we do with this story? An octogenarian oil man, a telomere startup, and the promise of a cure for death that never quite materialized. One reading is that Miller Quarles was simply wrong on the timeline and the mechanism. He believed that a single genetic lever, properly pulled, could make the human body essentially ageless within his remaining decades. The science we have now suggests that aging is a network problem, more like an entire failing power grid than a single blown fuse. Telomeres matter, but so does everything from immune exhaustion to protein misfolding. There is no one switch to flip, and trying to do it by turning telomeres fully back on may trade Alzheimer as and heart failure for metastatic cancer. From that angle, Quarles looks like a case study in techno-optimism, a wealthy believer convinced that an elegant theory on paper will scale cleanly into the chaos of human biology. But there's another reading. Quarles also saw something before most people were willing to say it out loud, that old age itself could be treated as a disease process open to intervention. He pushed against a cultural script that treats dying of old age as immutable and morally appropriate. His money helped launch a company that, while it did not stop aging, accelerated fundamental discoveries in telomere biology, stem cells, and cancer therapy, work that may eventually contribute to longer, healthier lives for millions. In that sense, he was early, not entirely wrong. There's also the social question he forced into the open. If we develop reliable ways to slow or partially reverse aging, even by a decade or two, who gets access? Geron's work was funded by venture capital and pharmaceutical partnerships, not national health services. The first beneficiaries of any true life extension technology are unlikely to be ordinary retirees. They're more likely to be the same class of wealthy early adopters Quarles himself belonged to. Critics of radical longevity warn of a world where physical aging slows for an elite few while everyone else continues to live and die on the old schedule, intensifying inequality not just of wealth but of time itself. Supporters argue that this is how many medical advances begin, expensive and exclusive at first, then commoditized and democratized over decades. Both positions carry uncomfortable truths. The record doesn't resolve them. The clock, the fuse, and the bet. We're left with two entwined legacies. On one side, a company that promised the moon and ended up, like many biotech firms, in the messy middle ground, producing valuable science, partial treatments, and a trail of patents rather than a neat cure for death. On the other, an aging Texan who treated time like a negotiable contract, betting his fortune that a few extra years of life might buy him centuries. The biology of telomeres did not grant him immortality. It did, however, change how we understand the clock built into our cells and how we talk about the possibility of resetting it. The fuse at the end of the chromosome is no longer just a metaphor. It's something we can measure, tweak, and, in some contexts, repair. Whether that will ever add up to the kind of world Miller Quarles imagined, a world where living to 150 is routine and death by old age is rare, or whether telomere science will remain one chapter and a larger, more complicated story of aging is still unresolved. For now, the promise of engineered immortality sits where Quarles left it, somewhere between a lab bench in California and a table in a Houston cafeteria, where an old man in a black hat once claimed he was only a few years away from cheating time. We can chart the experiments, read the patents, and map the chromosomes. What we can't yet say is whether the human lifespan is just another parameter in the code, or a boundary that resists every edit, because every mystery hides a truth.